Hi, I'm Becky Murray. How do we embrace the journey of life, even in the midst of a crisis? Have you ever gone through a time where everything seems to be going wrong in your life, despite you only ever making what you believe to be the right choices? It can be quite disheartening sometimes. Trials are never easy, but that's why we learn so much from going through them. This week, we're going to look at three men in the Old Testament who had such a faith and such a boldness right in the middle of their crisis moment. Sometimes I'm astounded at the boldness that I see on my little kids in Kenya. I've got one little boy called Leonard who was badly abused by his mother for years. But now that he's encountered the love of Christ that's changed his life, he's desperate for us to go out in the village and reach his mom, that she might also know this love. I see such a boldness on him and such the power of forgiveness that the same love that he's encountered, he now wants her to encounter despite her abusing him for years. A few years ago, I had the honour of leading a lady called Elizabeth to Christ in our village, who again displayed such boldness and faith that really challenged me. It was a genuine commitment, and she knew everything about her life had to change. The problem was, she was married to the local witch doctor. His name was Josvat. This man has literal waiting areas on his compound where dozens from the village come to him for treatment. His powers are very real, and his wife turning him to Christ was most certainly going to make him very angry. And so I was fearful that this would make the lady want to hide her fear to protect herself. But to my surprise, she became so vocal about how Jesus had changed her life. She joined our church, which is literally just kilometres away from the witch doctor's house. And she faithfully attends church every single week and has done so for the last couple of years. Her faith completely astounded me. And even though her very life could have been at risk, she fell so in love with Jesus and wanted everyone to know, including her husband. Well, you'll be delighted to know that several months later, I actually had the honour of leading the witch doctor to Christ too. I remember just the day before, we'd done a brand new intake of new kids coming into our home and school. And we have two lots of children in our care. We have what we call the King's Kids, which are children who live with us permanently. But then we also have home-based children. And these are children who have family members, but they're so poor that they can't afford regular meals or education or any medical care. And so we have home-based children that come to us first thing in the morning, have all their meals with us, have education, but then go home to their families at the end of the day. Wherever possible, we're passionate about keeping families together. And so just the day before, I'd done an intake interview and I'd accepted this one little girl called Davine. And the following day comes by and I'm determined, okay, this is the day I need to go and see the witch doctor. Now, I'm going to tell you, I was nervous. I've never gone to a witch doctor's house before. And I was nervous, so I didn't take the whole team that were with me on the missions trip. I just had a very small amount of people go with me. I'd pre-warned them and said, look, I have no idea what kind of welcome we're going to receive. It could be that he chases away with sticks and stones. I have no idea, but I just feel compelled we have to go and try and evangelize to the witch doctor. Well, I walked onto the compound of the witch doctor's land, and to my absolute surprise, who sat there playing on the floor but Davine? And it suddenly dawned on me, this is the witch doctor's daughter. I had no idea. No one had told me when I took her onto our program that she was the witch doctor's daughter. It wouldn't have made me want to take her any more or any less, so that's probably why they didn't tell me. But I walked onto this land, and then suddenly, where I had had fear, the moment I saw Davine, I knew God was in this. It was his timing. You know, God's really smart. God's in the detail of our lives. And literally just the day before, I'd accepted the witch doctor's daughter onto our program. So when we walked on the compound, instead of chasing us away with the sticks and the stones, instead he opened the door of his home for us to come in and talk with him. I'll never forget the moment of seeing him knelt on the mud-up floor with tears streaming down his face, as suddenly the revelation that had transformed his wife's life was now transforming his. I watched his wife in the months that preceded the witch doctor's salvation, and I saw such a courage on her life that I long for on my daily walk with God. You see, to really embrace your journey, you have to know who you are and what you believe, even if that makes you unpopular with your friends or your family. So today, I want to look at one of the most challenging scriptures in the whole Bible to me and read that with you. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it's their story, it's their lives that just totally wow me. About 600 years before Jesus Christ was born, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had surrounded Jerusalem and took captive many of Israel's finest young men, including Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These 4 Hebrew boys excelled in wisdom and knowledge and found favor with the king. Daniel was put in charge of the whole province, and at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as administrators under Daniel. So King Nebuchadnezzar is a man who dealt with pride. He's got a few pride issues in his life, but he's built this huge golden image, and he commands all the people that they have to fall down and worship this image whenever they hear the sound of the music that they play. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were determined they were only ever going to worship the one true living God. And so they refused to bow down to this golden image, and this gets reported back to the king. Courageously, they stood before the king as the king tries to pressure the men into bowing down, and they stand up for their faith. And so I want to read it with you. We're going to pick it up from verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men in before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them, saying, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time that you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image that I have made, then good. But if you do not worship, you will be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that can deliver you from my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But even if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image that you have set up. Even if not." Wow, these men had such a radical faith in God, declaring that they knew God was more than able. But they went above and beyond that, stating that even if not, we do not serve your gods. There was no doubt in their minds. If they'd have just stopped at the statement of saying, our God is able, we would have said, wow, what faith-filled people. But they went above and beyond that, declaring, but even if not, they had no doubt. You see, logic and reason would suggest that they could have said to themselves, let's just bow down, we'll tick the box. We're not really worshipping this golden image. We love God and he's first and foremost. But if we can stay alive to keep telling people about what God's doing, then, we can still maintain our level of influence as administrators over the nation. You see, if we lose that influence, we can't do any good. So they could have rationalized, with kind of fingers crossed behind their back, we'll pretend to bow down so that we can keep our influence and do good for it. But they didn't do that. They could have so easily compromised, and we would have all agreed that that made good sense. It would have been rational to make a compromise like that. Many would have gone down that road, but these men had integrity. They had purity and a radical faith that so challenges my heart. A few years ago, I gave birth to my gorgeous little boy, Josiah. Josiah's 7 years old now, and he's full of fun and brings so much joy. He's such a character. He's got quite the personality in his little body. But brings joy everywhere he goes. But when I had Josiah in 2011, he was very ill. I remember, the pregnancy went fine, the labor went fine, everything was wonderful. And then after giving birth to Josiah, he just wasn't feeding. Now, I was surrounded on a ward with all these other moms who were feeding their babies, and every few hours, their babies would cry. They would feed their babies, their babies would sleep, and then a couple of hours later, these babies would wake up again crying for another feed. My little baby wasn't doing that. Josiah wasn't crying for a feed. He would cry, don't get me wrong, but he wouldn't take a feed. He just wasn't feeding. And I kept speaking up, telling the midwives, hey, my baby's not feeding, you know, what's happening? And they were giving me the whole, you're a first-time mommy routine. And inside I'm thinking, is it me? Have I gone crazy? Is it these hormones making me like one of those crazy moms who are paranoid that their baby's ill? Or is it me? Am I going crazy? But I'd watch all these other babies start eating and my own little boy wouldn't eat. Well, eventually we got a doctor to come and listen to this crazy mama. And the doctor asked a few questions about when was it Josiah last ate and has he had any wet nappies and diapers and things like that and all these other questions. And all of a sudden she rushed my little boy into the special care baby unit. Well, on that unit, they put a tube down Josiah's nose that went into his stomach and he was fed through this tube. And so finally, I breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, somebody, A, is listening to me, but B, finally, my little baby is now getting the nutrients that his body so needs. Well, at this point, I breathe a sigh of relief. And so myself and my husband, Matthew, will leave the ward for a whole of 1 hour to go and register his birth. We come back from registering his birth, and as I walk in the room, I notice suddenly Josiah has a drip in his hand, and that wasn't there when we left the ward. And so I turned to the nurse and said, oh, why does Josiah have a drip? Well, I remember seeing the nurse's face as her face just dropped, and she said, have the doctors not spoken to you yet? The second she said that, my heart sunk. You see, as a nurse myself, I knew that if it was just something small, I would often tell the parents. But if something had gone really wrong, you get the doctors to come in and break the news to the parents. And in that moment, my heart just sunk. Josiah had had this huge, huge vomit. And so even the milk that had been passed to him through this tube was still not taking root in his body. And they realized at this point, there was something very wrong with our little baby boy. They rushed Josiah on a ventilator over to the children's hospital. I remember the surgeon saying to me, look, your baby's extremely weak. He's now 4 days old by this point, and he's had nothing gone into his body from the point of him being born, and he's now 4 days old. He was a very weak and vulnerable little baby. And the surgeon saying ordinarily they would wait for the baby to have some more goodness put in them before they would think of surgery. But he said to me, he said, I can't go home tonight and put my head on a pillow not knowing what's wrong with this little boy. And so right there with this tiny, very weak little baby, they did open surgery. And it was the longest hours of my life as Josiah was under surgery. They opened him up and found out that he had lots of different bowel problems and obstructions going on, and said they were able to deal with that. But in the days that followed the surgery, my little baby was still on a ventilator. And I remember being sat at the end of his little tiny ventilator, and all of a sudden this scripture of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego sprung to my mind. And with tears streaming down my face, I prayed probably the hardest prayer I've ever prayed in my life. I said, God, I know you're more than able to help my little baby. But even if not, even if for whatever reason it doesn't go the way I want it to go, even if not, I will not turn my back on you. I will continue to follow you. Well, thankfully, Josiah did come through. He had 5 major surgeries in the first year of his life, and it was a tough year of in and out of hospital, but now Josiah is healthy and he's strong and he's well. But that prayer was a monumental moment to me of genuinely praying, my God is able, but even if not. So let's carry on reading. Let's look at, carry on reading the story with Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and we'll pick it up from verse 23. The king at this point is furious. He's full of pride, he's full of anger, and so he actually orders that the furnace be heated up 7 times more so than normal, so much so that the very men who opened the furnace door were consumed by the flames. So let's go on and read it from verse 23 of Daniel 3. It says, and these men, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said, "O king, yes, this is true." "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men, loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. The form of the 4th is like the Son of God." Sometimes when you're in the middle of your battle, you can feel incredibly alone. I've been there. I've felt incredibly alone in those intense moments of pressure. It can feel quite lonely while the rest of the world is just carrying on by like nothing's wrong. Yet for you, everything feels like it's going desperately wrong. And it can feel very lonely. We can also feel like we're sometimes bound by the problems and the issues that seem to be hurtling our way. But Christ is right there with you. He looses any addiction. He looses any problem that the enemy is trying to bind you with if you let him. And just as they were 4 men and they were walking free in the midst of their furnace, so God can do that for you in the middle of your furnace moment. Verse 26 goes on to say, "Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here.' Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. The satraps, administrators, governors, the king's counselors all gathered together and saw these men on whose body the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of the fire was not on them." Wow. Let me tell you, the enemy might be trying to wipe you out. But when your faith is fixed on Christ, you'll come out of the fire unsinged. The smell of smoke will not even be upon you. Even the damage of the problem won't even surround you. Not only will you survive the furnace, you'll thrive the furnace. You see, there's a big difference between the reality of our circumstances and God's truth. The reality of the circumstances for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was they were in the middle of the fiery furnace. They were supposed to be consumed. They'd gone in as 3 men bound, and they were supposed to be consumed. Their circumstances were not great, but they leaned on the truth of God, and the truth of God set them free, and God was with them throughout that whole process. This is how you learn to embrace the journey, even in the midst of your furnace. I don't know what situations surround your life today. You know, sometimes our journeys aren't made up of nice, neat, straight roads. Sometimes we find ourselves in a furnace or in a pit that we never deserved to be in. But it's in those moments, if we will cry out to God, saying, even if not, then even life, if it does go against us, if it doesn't go how we want it to go, even if illness does come, even if relationships have broken down in our lives, if we will truly pray, even if not, we will not serve any other gods, we will not turn our back on you, Jesus, then there's a power that flows from us. When we truly rise up with the even if not mentality, we become an unstoppable force with boldness and with courage to embrace the journey that God has destined for our lives, even when it's not comfortable. It's in the face of death, or it's in the face of persecution that can we boldly declare in those moments, just like those 3 young men did, whether God rescues me or not, I will not compromise my faith. When we don't know how the end of the dilemma or how the end of the situation is going to play out, it's hard to rest secured. But the key is knowing that even in the middle of your mess, God is scribing the message of our lives. There's purpose right here and now. What might feel like chaos to us in the middle of our story will often make sense at the end of the story. You know, I often think about tapestries. I go around the beautiful museums we have in this beautiful nation, and I see all the old tapestries that date back years and years, and I look at the front and it's all beautiful, this incredible artwork of this tapestry. But if you look behind the back, it actually looks like a lot of different colours, all going in different directions. It looks pretty messy. There's lots of knots and there's lots of loose ends, and it looks like chaos. But when you look around the front, it looks beautiful. And I often think our lives can be like that. Our lives can feel like the mess, can feel like the chaos. But actually, when we get to go to eternity, we'll get to see the front, the tapestry of our lives, of what the incredible artist was doing in and through us if we're simply submissive and say yes to his way. You know, Corrie ten Boom wrote an incredible poem called The Master Weaver's Plan. I want to read that to you. And it's a beautiful little poem, and it says, "My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I cannot choose the colours he weaveth steadily. Oftentimes he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper, but I the underside. Not until the loom is silent and the shutters cease to fly will God unroll the canvas and reveal the reasons why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. He knows, he loves, he cares. Nothing this truth can dim. He gives the very best to those who leave the choice with him." Wow, what a beautiful poem. You know, all we get to see at the moment is the underside, but God is weaving together beautiful tapestry in and through your life if you'll just let him. He'll do it even through the events that we would have never chose for ourselves. I would have never chose the journey we went through with Josiah. We spent the whole of his first year in and out of hospital, having surgery after surgery, and he had to be ventilated multiple times. As a mummy, that was really hard to walk through. You want the best for your children, and you'd do anything to take that pain from them. I would have never chose to go through that. But I know God has a greater plan. He sees with an eternal perspective what I only see with a tiny, almost jigsaw puzzle kind of perspective. I guess the issues arise when we put a full stop where God's only put a comma. We hear a diagnosis and we consider that as being the very end of our story, when maybe it's just the middle. You know, I think about the crucifixion of Jesus, and at 3 p.m. that Friday afternoon, I'm sure all the people that surrounded the cross put a full stop. You know, Jesus, this incredible man of God, this holy man who'd done incredible miracles, who'd lived a pure and holy life, and yet now they're witnessing him on a cross. There's not much more death, there's not much more finality than death. And many people would have put a full stop right there at 3 p.m. that Friday afternoon. But God placed a comma. The story wasn't over. And it's so true when we think of this great adventure we have with Jesus. You see, because Jesus died, he didn't just die. That's a comma. He rose again 3 days later. And because he rose again, we now have salvation in and through Jesus Christ because he died and rose again. And the same is true of our lives. Don't put a full stop where God is simply placing a comma. So my challenge to you today is be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They didn't know how their story would end, but they had faith anyway. In the midst of their chaos, in the midst of their trials, they declared, even if not, and we can do the same. Let me pray with you. Father, I pray for anyone right now who's going through their time of chaos, who maybe feels like they're in the fiery furnace. And Father, I pray for any situations that come to bind their lives, that Father, you would break free, that you would loose the situation over their lives, that Father, you would be with them right in the middle of their furnace. Father, I know that you already are, but I pray that your Holy Spirit would be so real to them that they would feel your presence with them in that furnace. That Father, as we rise up with the boldness to declare, even if not, even if it doesn't go how I script it to go, even if life doesn't pan out how I want it to go, I trust you first and foremost. And even if not, I will not turn my back on you. I pray that that's challenged you today to rise up with an even if not mentality over your lives. Go for it. And as you embrace your journey of life with an even if not mentality, you'll see God do some incredible things in and through your lives. God bless you.